Didn't we just read that story last week? Seems like the same story. Peter and the dream. You remember last week I preached on transformation and tradition, and it was the same story. You might say, but it sounds like we're going over it again. It reminds me of the time a new pastor showed up at a church and he preached a sermon. It was a very good sermon. Everybody enjoyed the sermon, and they got together next Sunday all ready to hear him again, and he preached the exact same sermon, word for word. People everywhere was kind of whispering and saying, well, what's going on? Has he forgotten? Maybe he just moved in. Maybe his other sermons aren't unpacked, so they just excused it. And third Sunday came, and he preached the same sermon. Well, the deacons got worried. So they showed up to his office and said, now, Pastor, that's a fine sermon that you're preaching to us, but you've preached it 3 times now. Don't you have some other sermons? And the pastor said, of course I do. And as soon as you start doing that one, I'll move on to my next. This is a very similar story. I have not lost it. We're not having the same sermon twice. What is happening here is last week we looked at Acts chapter 10, where the actual events happened of Peter having this vision and going to Gentiles and God coming upon them and the gospel breaking through that barrier that all are open to receiving the grace of God. What happens here, though, in chapter 11 is that there is pushback. Have you ever noticed that there is ever a transformation, there is ever a change in the church, there's ever anything new, it doesn't take long for the pushback to come. We don't like that change. And so they begin to talk about Peter. They begin to talk about what happened, said, we're not sure if we're all okay with this. In other words, conflict breaks out into the church. But conflict is not always bad. In fact, it has opportunity within it. Have you ever noticed how conflicts have a way of coming around again and again? That we kind of argue about the same things over and over. The same old fights sometimes never get resolved. I was pastor of a church that had what I called the Great Shutter Debate. We had windows, not like here where you have beautiful stained glass, but we had windows where the sun came in, and they had shutters, but they were in sections, and the people always fought over the shutters. Some would come in and open them and say, oh, isn't it great to have light streaming in the sanctuary? And others would come in and shut the shutters right next to them and say, I can't stand that glare. So we had meetings about it, and we decided that we would open all of the bottom shutters so some light could come in, and then would leave the top shutters closed so that maybe some of the glare would come off, and no one was happy. Some said it's too much light, others said it's not enough light. So we said, okay, we'll do the opposite. We'll close all the bottom shutters so there won't be glare right there, and we'll open up the top shutters. Same thing. Nobody was happy. We fought over those shutters, and people opened and closed them until finally someday someone said, why don't we put stained glass in the church? Let's see if we could do something totally different. Today that church has beautiful stained glass and doesn't have a shutter in it. Someone had to just think differently outside of the box. We tend to have these same arguments over and over. And what was going on in the early church was, how far did the gospel really extend? How far was God's grace going to go? Was Christianity only a sect of Judaism, or was this going to go into the whole world? You wouldn't think they'd fight about this, because Jesus clearly told the disciples, you are to be my witnesses not only here in Jerusalem, but in Judea and Samaria and into the ends of the world. But even Peter, the leader of the church, didn't believe it at first until he received a dream and saw a transformation in the Gentiles. But he had to deal with this over and over. Paul, throughout his writings, he keeps dealing with this same issue. The early church fathers and mothers dealt with this. We still deal with this in some ways today. You might say, Pastor, we don't argue about these different Old Testament laws and whether or not folks have to be circumcised to be a part of the church. Well, actually, in some churches, the argument's still raised. But we do argue over whether or not we're going to focus on legalism or on grace. We still argue about who's in and who's out in our churches. Most churches don't even affirm that women are equal and of value, despite the grace of God in the book of Acts being poured out upon the men and the women. These things tend to come around again and again. It's not whether or not a church is ever going to have a disagreement or ever have conflict, but the question always is, how will we handle conflict when it happens? How are we, who are people who are given the grace of God but have different views and opinions, ever come together? I mean, conflicts happen in church. Someone sits in somebody's pew. Can you imagine that? We have battles over the budget. We have battles over leadership. We have theological issues we discuss. Someone once told me, you only fight with people you care about. It's too much energy to invest. My friend Chris Gamble says it this way. He says, if you've never had conflict, you really don't know each other. Think about that one a while. Once we truly get past the surface, we find out that we are a little bit different. And so it's not whether or not we're going to have conflict, even in a holy place called church, but how will we handle that? Well, let me give you some suggestions. The first is that we own the problem. We own the issue. Peter had baptized some Gentiles. He had stated that God's grace was bigger than anybody could imagine. He had had a dream and had had this transformation, but there were other leaders who had not had this dream, had not had this experience. And as we see the scripture this morning, it says that the apostles and believers throughout Judea heard that the Gentiles had also received the word of God. And you keep reading, and what happens? They begin to talk about each other. But they do something right, too. They talk to each other. Peter hears about the talk in Jerusalem, and what does he do? He goes to Jerusalem, and they talk it out. There were those who were a little bit more legalistic and didn't think Peter should be doing these things, and they talked to Peter. Peter had had this dream, and he said, let me talk to you and explain this to you. They didn't just whisper about each other. Hey, did you hear what Peter did? There was some of that going on, but mainly they talked directly to him. Peter didn't come back and say, you're a bunch of idiots for not understanding this. He came back and he said, let me explain. I too used to think this way, but God has transformed me. We don't always tend to own the issue. Sometimes we do what's called triangularization. When we have an opinion and someone else has an opinion, what we do? We go try to get folks on our side, right? We find a third person. We say, we're just venting, right? Or we're just trying to get another opinion, but what are we really trying to do? We're really trying to get somebody to be on our side. We need to talk directly to one another if we have disagreements. Speed Lees, who is a church consultant, talks about different levels of conflict. The first level is called a problem to solve. That is, there is no personalities involved. It's just there is some issue that needs to be resolved. The second level is a little bit up from that. It's a disagreement. This is when there's not only a problem to be solved, but there are personalities that get into the mix. A little more starts happening below the surface. Distrust might develop. If it's not solved at that problem, it goes up to the third level, which is called a contest. And in a contest, there is always a winner and a loser. There is this sense of camps and sides. Y'all have never been there, have you? Of course we have. The fourth level is called fight or flight. That's when we go past winners and losers and we say, somebody's got to go. And if it keeps going, it becomes an intractable situation where we don't even remember the issues, we only focus on personalities. Of all those levels, which is the easiest to solve conflict? Well, of course, it's level number one, right? A problem to solve. When we have conflict, whether in a church or with one another, if we can focus on what is an issue, what is actionable, what can we do to solve this together? Not to avoid it, not to blow it up, but to talk it out. You see, we always need to do everything we can to avoid what's called polarization. You know what polarization is. It's the way we are in America today. It's when you divide up into camps and you only talk to folks that agree with you. That's not happening, is it? Yes, of course it's happening. Look at Facebook. Do you know that Facebook has algorithms to send you stuff that you already agree with? That's how it works. You start liking something, they're going to send you more stuff that's just like that. So you like this side, they send you stuff that reaffirms what you already think. You like that side, they send you other stuff. You want to really confuse Facebook, start liking both stuff from the right and the left, and it'll confuse it. Won't know what to send you. You see, that's the way we are, though. It's not just Facebook. We tend to only find those we agree with, and we need to realize that we are more alike than we are different, that needed to accentuate our commonalities. We always have more in common than we have different. Some of you perhaps remember the movie Remember the Titans. I love that movie. It's about a 1971 football team at T.C. Williams High School in Virginia. Integration is being forced, and Denzel Washington plays Coach Herman Boone. He's trying to bring together two different schools through a football team. And there are black players and white players, and they get to go to camp together. And they go and get in the bus, and guess what happens? All the white players go to one bus, and all the black players go to another bus, and he gets on the bus and says, get off the buses. This bus, everyone who's offense get on it. This bus, everyone on defense get on it. And you've got to sit by someone not of your race. In fact, you're going to room with them, and he gives them an assignment. He says you've got to ask them about their family, you've got to ask them about their likes, you have to ask them about their dislikes, you have to ask them about their hopes, you have to ask them about their dreams, and you've got to report back to me what you find out. And guess what they find out? They find out that they are very, very much alike. Coach Boone says one day on a long run as they were in Gettysburg, they were standing on hollowed ground where brothers could not come together. And he says, if we do not come together today, we will too destroy ourselves. It's a very powerful speech in that movie. You see, we need to learn to assume the best in each other. It's so easy to assume the worst when we are in conflict. We attribute bad motives to one another. Someone says something to us and we take it wrong. We just assume that they're trying to get us or trying to goad us when they may actually be trying to help us. Maybe they're just asking a question. I had a former church member. He's gone on to be with the Lord now. His name was Bill, and he was once a pastor. He was a member of our church. Bill had some other issues, some emotional issues, and he would often talk to me during the week, and he'd call, and he'd want to talk about my sermon, and I didn't know how to take that because sometimes he had these deep questions, and at first I took it wrong. I thought he's questioning what I'm saying, and it wasn't that at all. The longer I got to know him, the more I realized that he missed being a pastor and that he was trying to connect with me through these questions and conversations about my sermon. He was actually very interested and my thoughts, and he wanted to share his thoughts. But we don't always understand each other. We don't always take things right. I remember listening some time ago to an NPR interview, and it was with a woman who'd written a book about adolescent boys. The first person who was interviewing her said, now that you've talked to all of these thousands of young boys, young men, what would you do differently? What would you tell moms about their sons? And she said this. She said, I used to tell moms, talk to them in the car. That's when you got them one-on-one. She said, then I talked to all these boys, and they hate that. They feel trapped in the car, and they don't like questions being asked of them. And they get aggravated, and it just gets worse. She says, I tell them now, go on a walk together. Let them open up at their pace. So we've got to learn that we have more alike than we do different. But we do have different personalities. I love this story with Peter in the early church because Peter doesn't get upset at these folks. He realizes that it's not personal, that they're thinking through a change that's going on in the church. He understands where they're coming from, for he was there not too long ago. And so he communicates with them because communication is key. In fact, communication is the oxygen of relationships. It's how relationships survive. And so Peter does something interesting. He listens to his critics. Listening to others. God gave us one mouth and two ears. You've heard that many times, I bet. So that we might listen. Most of us are forming responses before we hear what's going on. When I was in high school, I was on the debate team, and we'd have to listen to the other side, tell their arguments, but at the same time, we had to prepare because we were about to stand up and give a counter argument. It was so difficult to hear what they were saying while I was trying to think of what I was going to say. Sometimes I lost debates because I dropped something completely. Because I was giving a counter argument and they kept talking and they put in another argument that I'd missed because I was thinking about something else. That's the way it is in life. We often don't hear it all. We don't understand what's going on. Did you hear about the mom who came in and her two kids were fighting over an orange? They were literally about to come to blows. She remembered Solomon and the baby, and she said, I will cut the orange in half. And her daughter said, that's great. Can I have the outer half? She said, what? She said, I just need some of the rind because I'm making a cake and it says to zest, and I need the outside of it. And her son said, well, I only wanted to eat the stuff on the inside. And mom said, why didn't y'all at least talk this out? Because no one was listening. We need to learn to clarify meaning with each other. When someone says something to us, make sure we understand it before we go on. Did you say this? Let me make sure I understand it. Reflect what's happening here. So many times we go off when we don't even understand what's happening. During the Korean War, there was a British Army unit tasked with holding a hill. They were about to be overrun. They were outnumbered 8-1. They called up their superiors, who happened to be an American commander, and the British officer said this. He said, things are a bit sticky here, sir. Well, British have understatement. What that would really translate to us is, things are desperate, send help. But the American didn't understand it. He didn't clarify it. He didn't say, what does that mean, things are a bit sticky? And so he sent no reinforcements, and they were overrun. We have so many different ways of miscommunicating. And it's so easy just to ask, what is it that you mean? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Ask these clarifying questions and reflect what's going on. Be empathetic. Folks are so amazed when you actually listen to one another, when you actually feel heard. So many times that's all people need is just to be heard. But when it comes time to speak, I suggest that we use I statements. So often in church I hear that word they. They did this or they did that. There is no they in church, folks. We're Baptist. It is we. We are the church. There are you statements and I statements. You statements put people off. They put people on guard. They make them defensive. You make me so mad. That's blaming. You little inconsiderate creep. That's judging. You better shut up. That's threatening. Of course, you're an expert. That was sarcasm. You need to. That's controlling. Anytime we're trying to force the other person into something with this you stuff, it's probably not going to go very well. But when we use I statements, we claim how we feel and we are less threatening to others. We are simply coming out of our own place. I'm angry that such and such has happened. It just doesn't seem right to me. I feel taken advantage of when you don't clean up after yourself. I feel disrespected when you raise your voice. I'd like to share something here. I have an opinion. I'd like to be valued. I appreciate you and what you're doing. Look at the scripture this morning in Peter's story. The conflict comes out and he goes back and they come together and they're face to face. And Peter's entire conversation with them when he begins to talk is an I statement. I was in Joppa. I had a vision. I saw animals. I heard a voice. I said, no way. And God said, yes. And I said, I might need to think through this. I heard some folks outside that wanted me to come and go with them to Caesarea. I went to Caesarea. I preached. I saw God move in new ways. And now I am changed because God has moved in my heart and my mind. When we come out of our own story and what God is doing, it goes so far. Sometimes we just need to try a new technique. Do you know that there are different types of learners? I know I got a lot of school teachers here, so you know that. I'm a visual learner. I need to see it. I need a picture. I need a chart. There are also audio learners, thank goodness, because that's what a sermon is. There's some folks that just hear it or read it. There are others who are sensory learners. They need to do. They need to be hands-on. Sometimes we need to think, maybe there's a different way I can explain this. I had a lady one time come to me and she said, I don't get it. I keep telling my kids the same thing over and over, and I get louder and louder, and they just don't hear me. I said, well, have you ever tried anything different? Have you ever sat down with them and just sat there quietly? Or asked them, what is your opinion about this? Or how might we come together? I had a friend that used to joke. He said, I told my wife I loved her when I married her, and I'll tell her if anything changes. Don't know why she needs to keep hearing that. Of course she needs to hear it. Gary Chapman has made a living off of this. It's called the 5 love languages. Words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, physical touch. These are different ways different folks feel loved. And we need to be bilingual. You see, churches that are strong don't avoid conflict. They rather embrace it and find ways to collaborate constructively together. They know that we're always in it together. I heard a story years ago about two farmers who were fighting. So one went to the other's farm and poured salt in his well. Well, guess what? Within a couple of days, his own well tasted a little salty too. They had the same groundwater, and he didn't think quite through that. We all live in the same system. And what we do to help each other helps all, and what we do to hurt each other hurts all. I love every once in a while when I hear a story about a barn raising. Y'all know a barn raising when the community comes together and builds someone a barn. Perhaps one's burned down or it's just needed. That's such a great illustration to me. When I was in seminary, I had a little church I went to on the weekends and preached to them. Shoals Baptist Church, I've told you about them before. They were such gracious people to let someone who didn't know how to preach very well just practice on them. And they came and they listened. And they taught me more than I probably ever taught them. I remember our roof started leaking. They said, Pastor, next Saturday, come a little bit early. We're going to do something about this roof. I didn't know what was going to happen. I got there, and there were pallets of shingles around the church. And I said, where did these come from? And someone said, we ordered them. And I said, well, who's going to pay for them? Because I knew our little budget couldn't replace a roof. And there was a fella there whose wife came to our church every Sunday, and he never came. Everybody thought he was the biggest heathen in the world. We prayed for him at that church because he just wouldn't come to church. But he was there that morning. He came over, put his arm around me and said, Pastor, don't worry about where these shingles came from. It's all taken care of. Now grab a hammer and get up on the roof with us. I got up on the roof, and not only were my church members there were church members from the Methodist Church and the Brethren Church and others. They had all heard about it. They'd all come to help put a new roof on the Baptist church. It was an amazing sight. My friends, when we cooperate, when we look at issues and say these are just problems to be solved, and leave the personalities out of it, and accentuate what is right and good, we can be like that early church. For all through the book of Acts, we keep hearing a refrain, and the Lord added greatly to his church. It only takes opening our hearts and minds to the Spirit and the grace of God. This morning now we come to a time of commitment, a time when we examine our own hearts and minds, a time when we also welcome those to make decisions. If you have something you need to talk to me about, I hope that you will give me a call this week and let me find a way to sit down with you. And let us give our lives more fully to God as we hear James sing this song.